The moment my dad said, "You deserve this," changed everything in ways I never expected or imagined. It didn't feel like a normal moment of anger or disappointment. It felt like the ground under me had shifted, like someone had quietly pulled away the last piece of support I was standing on. His voice wasn't loud, it wasn't explosive, it wasn't even emotional. It was calm, almost frighteningly calm, and that calmness made the words cut sharper than if he had yelled them. There was something final in the way he said it, something that made me realize that whatever was happening around me wasn't just a mistake, an accident, or a misunderstanding. It was a decision. A choice. And it was a choice made by someone who should have been the one protecting me before anyone else. I felt the eyes of everyone around us turn toward me, some curious, some confused, some secretly entertained. They were waiting for my reaction, waiting to see if I would cry, break, argue, or defend myself, but I didn't do any of those things. I just stood there, frozen in a moment I never asked to be a part of, feeling every emotion collide inside me all at once: hurt, disbelief, anger, shame, and something else deeper, something harder to explain, something that began to burn quietly like a slow, steady flame. It wasn't the kind of flame that explodes outward, it was the kind that grows from the inside, the kind that changes a person from the core outward. Until that day, I believed there were limits to what family could do to you. I believed there were invisible lines that parents simply did not cross, no matter how upset or frustrated they were. But watching him side with someone else, watching him justify their actions, watching him say those words so effortlessly, it made me understand that sometimes the people who are supposed to stand with you can become the very people who push you down. It wasn't just the words themselves, it was the tone, the timing, the casual way he delivered them, as if the judgment was already written long before the situation even began. I could feel something shift inside me, something subtle but powerful, like the first crack in a wall that has been holding back years of unspoken emotions. In that moment, I stopped being the person who waited for someone else to defend me, explain me, or fix things for me. I realized that no one was going to save me from this, not even the one person I always thought would. And that realization didn't make me weaker, it made me sharper, more aware, more awake than I had been in a long time. I could hear the murmurs around us, soft whispers, the kind that float through the air like dust, barely visible but impossible to ignore. Some people were shocked, others were indifferent, and a few wore expressions that suggested they had been waiting for something like this to happen. I felt humiliation tightening in my chest, but underneath it, there was a strange clarity forming, a sense of purpose that I didn't fully understand yet. I started replaying every moment leading up to this point, the conversations, the subtle warnings, the small tensions I had brushed aside because I didn't want to believe they meant anything. And suddenly, they all made sense in a way that was almost painfully obvious. It was like the world had been giving me hints, quiet signals, and I had ignored them because I trusted the wrong people. Now, watching him stand there, confident I didn't respond to him then. I didn't argue or defend myself or point out how wrong he was. I just let the moment settle into me, let the reality of it sink deep enough that I would never forget what it taught me. Because while everyone else thought I was frozen from shock, I was actually absorbing everything I needed to move forward, everything I needed to change the direction of the story they thought they controlled. And even though no one knew it at the time, that single sentence from him was the beginning of something none of them saw coming, something that would change the way they looked at me forever. How humiliation turned into the fuel for my comeback is something I didn't understand all at once. It was a slow, uncomfortable realization that grew inside me long after the moment had passed. At first, the humiliation felt raw, heavy, and almost impossible to carry. It sat in my chest like a weight I couldn't move, replaying itself over and over again every time I closed my eyes or tried to think about something else. The memory of their faces, the smirks, the judgment, the quiet satisfaction some of them took in seeing me pushed down, it all clung to me in ways that made even breathing feel like a task. I thought humiliation only broke people, that it only brought shame and silence, but I learned very quickly that humiliation is a strange kind of catalyst. It hurts, it burns, it exposes every insecurity you have, but beneath all that pain, it also has a way of sharpening you, of forcing you to see yourself without illusions, without excuses, without the comforting lies you tell yourself to avoid the truth. In the beginning, I tried to resist it. I tried to brush it off, pretend it didn't matter, act like it was just a bad moment that would fade with time. But humiliation doesn't disappear just because you pretend not to feel it. It lingers, it gnaws at you, it demands to be acknowledged. And after enough nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling, that question followed me everywhere. I heard it in the silence after conversations, in the pause before answering messages, in the stillness of early mornings when the world hadn't woken up yet. It made me notice things I had ignored for too long, patterns in how I treated myself, the way I downplayed my abilities, the way I tolerated disrespect because I didn't want to create conflict, the way I let others decide my worth while I stayed in the background hoping they would see the real me without me ever having to step forward. All of that was tied to the humiliation I felt in that moment. And for the first time, I asked myself whether I was living the way I deserved or whether I had been shrinking myself to fit into places that were never meant for me. That question didn't feel like shame, it felt like a challenge. Humiliation pushes you inward at first, but once you stop resisting, it pushes you forward. I started paying attention to the small sparks inside me that I used to ignore, the ideas that came when I was alone, the dreams I shoved to the side because I thought I wasn't ready, the strength I never used because I didn't want to seem difficult or disruptive. All those unnoticed parts of me suddenly felt louder, clearer, more insistent. It was almost strange how the same moment that had made me feel so weak was now exposing all the places in my life where I had been holding back my strength. I realized that the humiliation didn't come solely from what others did to me, it also came from the fact that I had allowed myself to stay small for far too long. And that realization didn't destroy me, it woke me up. Slowly, I began to see the humiliation as a kind of mirror. It showed me who I had been, not to shame me, but to show me who I could become if I stopped letting fear dictate my choices. I started making small changes, not dramatic ones, but ones that signaled to myself that I was no longer willing to live passively. I spoke up when I normally would have stayed. People around me noticed the shift. Some were surprised, others confused, a few uncomfortable. But I didn't care. Their reactions no longer defined me the way they once did. I wasn't living for their approval or their respect anymore. I was living with the understanding that the sense of humiliation I had felt was not a punishment, it was a warning that I was meant for more than the version of myself they were used to seeing. I used the memory of that painful moment as a reminder of where I never wanted to stand again, silent, embarrassed, waiting for someone else to tell me whether I was allowed to rise. Every time doubt tried to creep in, I thought back to that moment and felt the sting again, not to hurt myself, but to remind myself how far I had come and what I refused to go back to. In a strange way, humiliation became the most honest teacher I ever had. It stripped away the illusions, the false confidence, and the comfortable lies. It left me exposed, but in that exposure, it also left me free. Free to build myself again without the limitations others had placed on me, free to chase what I had been too afraid to pursue, free to become the version of myself that no one expected but I always knew was waiting underneath the surface. And even though the memory of that moment still lingers, it doesn't haunt me anymore, it fuels me, reminding me who I am becoming every time I remember how it all began. The silent strength I built while everyone doubted me didn't appear suddenly like a dramatic transformation, it grew gradually, quietly, in the spaces where people thought I was weakest. Doubt from others has a strange way of echoing inside your mind, repeating itself until it starts sounding like your own voice. For a long time, I let their opinions define what I believed I could or couldn't do. Every comment disguised as advice, every smirk that suggested I wasn't capable, every dismissive look, they chipped away at me piece by piece. But what no one realized was there's a specific kind of silence that comes from being underestimated. It's the silence of rooms where your ideas are ignored, the quietness after your voice is talked over, the pause people leave after you speak as if your words don't carry any weight. I used to take that silence as a sign that I wasn't enough, that I needed to shrink myself even more to avoid causing discomfort. But as time passed, I realized that their silence wasn't a reflection of my worth, it was a reflection of their inability to see beyond their own expectations. And instead of letting that destroy me, I started using it as space to think, space to observe, space to understand who I was becoming. I stopped reacting defensively and started learning quietly. I noticed how people moved, how they treated others, how their confidence often came from nothing more than loud voices and empty certainty. And in contrast, I found myself growing into a different kind of strength, one that didn't need validation or noise to exist. The doubt people directed toward me slowly became the background music of my journey. It didn't motivate me out of revenge or desperation, it simply reminded me that if I wanted to rise, I would have to do it in a way that didn't rely on anyone else. So I started listening to myself more than I listened to them. I started trusting the subtle instincts I used to ignore, the quiet thoughts I brushed off because they didn't align with what others believed. I began choosing actions based on what felt right to me, not what would satisfy their opinions. Each time I made one of those choices, I felt a small shift inside me, like I was reclaiming a part of myself I had given away without realizing it. Strength built in silence feels different from the strength people acquire through applause or public victories. It's steadier, more rooted, harder to shake. While people doubted me, I learned how to stand still without collapsing under pressure. I learned how to keep moving even when there were days when the doubt felt heavier than my own hope, moments where I wondered if staying silent meant I was losing, if not fighting back meant I was giving in. But with time, I realized that silence can be strategic. Not every battle needs to be fought with words or confrontation. Sometimes, the best thing you can do is let others underestimate you while you prepare for what they never saw coming. Their doubt gave me room to plan, room to improve, room to build a version of myself that didn't need their permission to exist. I learned that silence isn't weakness when used intentionally, it's a form of discipline, a way of choosing not to waste energy on things unworthy of your potential. The strength I built didn't come from proving them wrong, it came from proving to myself that their opinions weren't the measure of my life. I stopped expecting fairness, understanding, or support from people who had already decided who I was in their minds. Instead, I began relying on the version of myself that existed beyond their imagination. I started waking up with a sense of purpose, even if no one else could see it. I began moving differently, thinking differently, carrying myself with a quiet confidence that came not from being praised but from knowing I had survived everything meant to break me. Their doubt became the noise that made my own inner voice easier to recognize. And slowly, the silence that once felt like a cage began to feel like a sanctuary. In that quiet space, I discovered resilience stronger than anything I had imagined. I learned how to breathe through chaos without letting it swallow me. I learned how to stay calm when everything felt unstable. I learned how to trust the path I was creating, even when it was invisible to everyone else. What they mistook for passiveness was actually preparation. What they interpreted as fear was actually focus. What they dismissed as weakness was the foundation of a strength they had no capacity to recognize. By the time I started rising, it wasn't with noise or anger, it was with a steady certainty that didn't need to announce itself. Those who doubted me looked confused, surprised, even threatened, because they couldn't understand how someone they had counted out could stand so firmly without demanding their validation. But that's the thing about strength built in silence, it doesn't need to be seen to be real. It grows in the shadows, in the private battles no one knows you're fighting, in the quiet decisions you make when no one is watching. And while they doubted me, I was learning how to carry myself with a resilience that no amount of noise or judgment could shake, a resilience that would later become the force that changed everything. The plan that flipped the power dynamic without anyone noticing didn't start as a grand strategy or some perfectly calculated scheme, it began as a quiet thought, a small realization that I didn't have to fight the way they expected me to. People who think they have power over you always expect loud reactions, emotional outbursts, desperate attempts to regain control. They feed on those reactions because it confirms their superiority. But I learned that the most effective shift in power happens when you stop reacting and start observing, when you stop showing them what you feel and start showing them nothing at all. silence, patience, and timing can become weapons sharper than anger, and I realized that if I wanted to change the situation, I had to approach it with a kind of calmness they would never see coming. I spent days simply watching the dynamics around me, noticing who spoke with confidence they didn't earn, who manipulated with smiles, who relied on intimidation disguised as authority. When you step back from the noise and look carefully, you start to see patterns, how people move, how they communicate, how predictable they actually are once you stop letting emotions cloud your judgment. I realized that the ones who seemed. So I began building my plan quietly, piece by piece, without drawing attention to myself. I avoided unnecessary conflicts, not because I was scared but because I needed space to think. I let them believe I was still the same, still hurt, still uncertain, still affected by their opinions. That illusion became my biggest advantage. People reveal their true weaknesses when they think you have none of your own strength left. They become careless, blind to the preparation happening right in front of them. And while they dismissed me, I started strengthening every part of myself they had underestimated. I gathered information, learned the rules they thought I didn't understand, paid attention to the details they overlooked, and slowly built a plan that didn't rely on confrontation but on precision. What I needed wasn't a dramatic moment, it was a turning point disguised as normal events. The beauty of flipping a power dynamic silently is that by the time people notice, it's too late for them to undo it. I learned how to speak less but say more, how to act without announcing my intentions, how to make choices that seemed small but carried long-term impact. Each action was like moving a piece on a chessboard, not rushing to checkmate but creating a position so strong that the outcome became inevitable. I made connections quietly, strengthened relationships they ignored, planted seeds in places they didn't bother to look. Bit by bit, I built influence in the shadows while they clung to their illusion of dominance. There were moments when I doubted myself, moments when I wondered if staying quiet meant I was losing instead of preparing. But every time that doubt crept in, I reminded myself that the greatest changes rarely make noise while they are forming. Mountains don't shift loudly, storms gather long before their first thunder. I kept moving with intention, trusting the path I was shaping, trusting the small steps that were building towards something bigger. I stopped EXP. The day I realized my plan was working was quiet, almost anticlimactic. There was no grand confrontation, no dramatic scene. It was subtle, a change in their tone, a hint of caution in their voice, a flicker of uncertainty in their eyes. They had begun to sense something different, something they couldn't put into words, something they couldn't control anymore. They started second-guessing themselves, whispering among each other, trying to figure out what had changed. They didn't know that the shift had started long before they noticed it, that the power they once held had been slipping from their hands little by little. The moment they felt unsure wasn't the beginning of the change, it was the confirmation that the change had already happened. People always think power is about being loud, being authoritative, being in control of the room. But true power is quiet, stable, unshakable. It doesn't need to dominate others, it simply exists, rooted in inner certainty. As my plan unfolded step by step, I realized I didn't need to defeat them, I only needed to become someone they could no longer control. And that transformation didn't require anyone's permission. I didn't need them to acknowledge the shift, the results spoke for themselves. The actions they took so confidently before became hesitant. The assumptions they made so casually turned uncertain. The roles they believed were permanent began to reverse without any announcement. The most satisfying part wasn't watching them lose power, it was realizing how much of my own I had regained. Not because of revenge, not because of victory, but because I had rebuilt myself from the inside out. The power dynamic flipped not because I fought harder but because I grew smarter, calmer, and more intentional. They had underestimated the strength that comes from silence, patience, and strategy, and by the time they realized the truth, I had already stepped into a position they never imagined I could reach. The shift didn't need the moment they realized I wasn't the victim, didn't arrive with chaos, shouting, or any dramatic announcement. It came quietly, the same way many truths reveal themselves, slipping into their awareness slowly until they could no longer deny what was happening. For so long, they had been certain that I was the one beneath them, the one struggling, the one powerless, the one who had no choice but to endure whatever they decided. They had grown comfortable in that belief, so comfortable that they never imagined the roles could reverse. They believed their position was unshakable, their advantage permanent, their influence unquestionable. They saw me as fragile, naive, predictable. But they didn't realize that the version of me they thought they controlled no longer existed. And when the truth finally reached them, it was written across their faces with an expression I will never forget. It began with a shift in their behavior, something so small that most people wouldn't have noticed. A pause before they spoke to me, a flicker of uncertainty in their eyes, a sudden need to explain themselves where before they demanded explanations from me. They started asking questions instead of making statements, watching me instead of dismissing me, recalculating their assumptions in real time. For the first time, they weren't sure what I was capable of. And that uncertainty terrified them more than anything else could have. They had built their confidence on the belief that I would always be predictable, always be the one trying to prove myself, always be the one waiting for their approval. But now, without any dramatic confrontation, they could feel the ground shifting beneath them. Their power no longer landed the way it used to. Their words no longer dug into me. Their actions no longer defined my direction. And that realization unsettled them in a way they couldn't hide. I didn't need to expose them publicly or humiliate them to show the shift. It was enough for them to see that I no longer reacted the way I once did. The silence they once took as submission became a mirror that reflected their own insecurity back at them. The calmness they mistook for weakness became the shield they couldn't penetrate anymore. And the lack of fear they sensed in me unnerved them deeply. They had relied on my fear to control me, on my doubt to guide my decisions, on my need for validation to keep me in line. But when I stopped giving them those reactions, it was like pulling the foundation out from beneath everything they had built. They couldn't understand how someone who had once been so affected, so easily shaken, could now stand so quietly, so steadily, without flinching. The shift didn't come from revenge or anger, it came from growth, the kind they never believed I was capable of. I had learned how to see through their tactics, how to recognize manipulation wrapped in concern, how to identify control disguised as guidance. I stopped explaining myself, stopped apologizing for things that weren't my fault, stopped shrinking to make them comfortable. With every boundary I put in place, they felt a little more exposed, a little more powerless, a little more desperate to regain the control they were losing. They tried the same tactics that had worked on me before, subtle guilt, passive remarks, forced authority, but those methods slipped right off me now, like water off stone. And the more they realized their old methods no longer worked, the more uneasy they became. There was a moment, a simple one, quiet and almost ordinary, that marked the turning point. They said something they thought would trigger me the way it once did, something meant to shake me, remind me of where I supposedly stood. But instead of reacting with hurt or confusion, I just looked at them with a calmness they weren't prepared for. I didn't argue, defend myself, or justify any tea. After that, their tone changed around me. They spoke with caution, with hesitation, even with a hint of respect they had never offered before. They started checking my reactions the way I once checked theirs. They started overthinking their words, knowing that they no longer had the power to define me. It wasn't that I wanted to intimidate them, it was that the truth had become undeniable. I wasn't the person they thought they could break. I wasn't the quiet, uncertain figure standing in their shadow. I wasn't the target they could use to boost their ego or establish dominance. I had become someone who didn't fear them, didn't rely on them, and didn't bend to their expectations. And that made them vulnerable in ways they had never imagined. What made the moment even more powerful was that I didn't have to gloat, boast, or declare victory. The shift spoke for itself. The fear they once tried to instill in me now lived quietly in their own expressions. The doubt they once projected onto me now settled into their own decisions. They realized that the version of me they thought they controlled was a memory. And the version standing before them now was someone they could no longer manipulate, diminish, or silence. Without raising my voice, without seeking revenge, without fighting the way they expected, I had become someone stronger than the person they had tried to defeat. And the realization that they were the ones losing power, slowly, silently, irrevocably, hit them harder than any revenge could have. Their shock wasn't loud. It was in the way they stepped back, the way their voices softened, the way their confidence cracked around the edges. They weren't afraid of what I would do to them, they were afraid because they finally understood what they could no longer do to me. How my final move shocked everyone, including the ones who caused the damage, is something I still replay in my mind because it wasn't just a reaction, it was the quiet result of everything I had endured, every moment I had stayed silent, every time I had swallowed the bitterness someone else served me as if I had no choice but to accept it. People think shocking moments come suddenly, with loud gestures or dramatic declarations, but the truth is that real shock is born in silence, in patience, in the long stretches of time where no one believes you're doing anything at all. I learned that people rarely pay attention to the quiet ones, they assume silence is weakness, or fear, or surrender. They forget that silence can also be strategy, that stillness can be the moment before movement, that calm can be the place where storms are planned. So when I finally decided to make my move, no one was prepared, not because it was impossible to see, but because they never believed I was capable of creating anything that could change the entire balance of power they thought they controlled without question. I remember watching them for months, maybe even years, repeating the same patterns, acting as if what they did to me was normal, justified, or deserved. They created their own version of the story where they were the heroes and I was the problem, and they convinced themselves so deeply that they saw no reason to question their version of events. They moved through the world with the confidence of people who believe they will never face consequences, the confidence of people who think the damage they've caused is too scattered, too subtle, too deeply buried to ever come back to them. They believed they had broken me, that I would stay in the place where they left me, that my silence meant I had accepted my fate instead of preparing for something they could never predict. They assumed that because I didn't fight them openly, I wasn't fighting at all. They never understood that. The truth is, every moment they pushed me down became a map of where to strike later. Every insult, every denial, every attempt to erase me or minimize me or make me feel too small to matter became a thread I kept track of, not out of obsession, but out of clarity. I began to see the structure behind their actions, the weaknesses in the walls they built around themselves, the cracks they didn't bother to seal because they thought no one would dare to look closely. And while they continued with their routines, confident and careless, I studied the parts of their world they ignored. I listened when they thought no one was listening. I observed when they believed no one was watching. I prepared quietly, calmly, without giving away a single hint of what I intended to do. The day everything shifted didn't look dramatic from the outside. There was no explosive confrontation, no heated argument that could have warned them of what was coming. It began with something small, almost invisible, a move so subtle that even I almost doubted how powerful it would become. But power is strange like that, it doesn't always show itself in big gestures. Sometimes it hides in choices made at the right moment, in decisions no one expects, in acts that seem simple until the consequences unfold and reveal everything that had been building beneath the surface. When I took that step, when I finally activated the plan I had been shaping quietly over time, the first reaction wasn't anger or denial, it was confusion. They didn't understand what was happening. They didn't even realize at first that the shift came from me. That was the part that satisfied me the most, not because I wanted to humiliate them, but because it proved how little they ever understood me to begin with. People around us began to notice the changes before they did. Whispers started. Questions rose. Their certainty wavered. The world that had seemed so tightly controlled by their hands began to unravel, not in chaos, but in a slow, undeniable reversal of roles. I watched the realization form in their eyes over time, the way disbelief turned into recognition, and recognition into fear, not fear of me, but fear of the truth they had tried so hard to bury. They looked at me differently then, as if seeing me for the first time, not as someone they could step on, but as someone they had underestimated. Their expressions shifted in ways they couldn't hide. Some tried to mask it with false confidence, others with nervous smiles, but the shock was there, raw and unmistakable. What surprised them the most wasn't the move itself, but the fact that I had the strength to carry it out. They thought the damage they caused had destroyed any possibility of a comeback. They thought their actions had shaped my future forever, never considering that I might reshape it myself. They had written me off as a chapter in their story, not realizing I was rewriting the entire book. Even the people who supported them, or stayed silent, or watched from the sidelines because it was easier than standing up for what was right, found themselves stunned by how everything shifted. For once, they were forced to pay attention, forced to see the person they had overlooked, forced to confront the reality that the quietest one in the room had been holding the sharpest truth all along.